Welcome to the Mount Pleasant Podcast, featuring discussions and interviews about the people, places, and events that make Mount Pleasant such a special place.
This is the Mount Pleasant Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Cleary, and all thanks to the great people at Mount Pleasant Magazine, I get the honor and the privilege of introducing you to Mount Pleasant, the people who make it such a special place to do business, to work, and even to live. We're introducing you to Mount Pleasant's best on the Mount Pleasant Podcast. Coming up, it's election time. Fall means a lot of things, and college football is only one of them. A big election is coming up in November, and we're so proud to have on Mount Pleasant Podcast one of the candidates that's running to represent the Lowcountry from District 1. I'm Brian Cleary, and Mount Pleasant Podcast today is proud to welcome Dr. Annie Andrews. Dr. Andrews, thanks so much for taking the time. I have to think this is definitely your busy time.
Yes, definitely a busy few weeks in my life, but I am happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So when you were growing up in Indiana, I guess outside of Indianapolis, was there ever a time that you said to your mom or dad, I think I'll be a congresswoman at some point?
Absolutely not. No, this was never part of my plan. In fact, I was very dedicated to what my actual plan was, which was to be a doctor. I knew I was going to be a doctor from when I was in preschool. I don't know where I got the idea. I didn't have any doctors in my family, but my whole life as a child and a young adult was built around my goal of being a physician. And I am a pediatrician at the Children's Hospital, and I love that job.
Well, we love the fact that you're working at the MUSC Sean Jenkins Children's Hospital. So your parents don't have a medical background? I know you have two brothers. Anybody else in the medical profession?
No, literally nobody in the medical profession in my family. My husband is a physician, and many of his family members are in the medical profession. But no, I am the first in my family.
So you went to school in Cincinnati, Ohio, an amazing medical school there. The first question that people have to have then about that is, does that mean you're an Ohio State Buckeye fan?
My husband is, but since I grew up in Indianapolis, no, I more lean towards the Indianapolis teams. We grew up cheering for Notre Dame and IU, and my parents went to Ball State. So,
well, you know how sometimes the Buckeye fans are treated here. I'm sure your husband gets a little bit of love sometimes, and then other times not so much. So what is it that brought you here to the Lowcountry?
Yeah, so my husband actually matched at MUSC for his emergency medicine residency, which he started back in 2008. So that's what originally brought us down here. He moved in 2008, and I finished up my residency at Cincinnati Children's Hospital and then moved down in 2009. And I think initially we probably figured, we're both from the Midwest. We'll just spend a few years in the Southeast and then move on. But we immediately fell in love with living in the Charleston area. We got engaged on Folly Beach. We got married at Patriots Point. All three of my kids were born at East Cooper and go to the public schools in Mount Pleasant. So this very quickly became home. And my parents have also since relocated here, and they also live in Mount Pleasant. So this is our home, and we are here to stay.
There's a lot of lovely places here in the Lowcountry. You mentioned getting engaged on Folly, et cetera. What was it that drew you to Mount Pleasant in terms of, I'm going to live here?
So when we really decided to settle in here and raise our family here, we knew we wanted to live somewhere that had great schools for our kids. My kids are in public schools at Mount Pleasant Academy, and we wanted to live in a neighborhood that was full of kids so that our kids could ride their bikes after school, run around from house to house. And that really, we're so fortunate to be able to live in a community like Mount Pleasant where those things are possible. And we also knew we wanted to be close to MUSC since we both work downtown on the peninsula. And, Mount Pleasant was just a really great fit for us.
And your children, all girls, how old would they be?
Girl, boy, girl, and they are 10, 8, and almost 6. My youngest has a birthday a few days before the election, so we're trying to figure out how to celebrate her birthday in the midst of this crazy election season.
I don't know how you do it. I mean, being a physician, time enough. A mom to 3, time enough there. And now you found time to run to represent the Lowcountry in Congress. So if we take the issues away from anything just for a second, you've got a good job. You've got a great family. Politics is not the nicest of things. So what is it that motivated you that said, yeah, I might be a doctor and stuff, but I'm going to run because...
It's a culmination of my experience working at the Children's Hospital for the past 13 years. Really, all of society's problems walk into a children's hospital. They also walk through the doors of our public school system. And so the culmination of everything I've seen over the past decade plus, caring for children of the Low Country, plus my role as a mother. I believe that our children deserve leaders who will fight for them. And there's so many issues that I feel are very urgent that I feel like we need a child advocacy-focused person to represent us in Washington, D.C. Also, emerging from the COVID pandemic, it was very plain to me that we need more folks with a scientific or healthcare background serving at all levels of government.
I'm sure your husband is very supportive of your effort, but was there a point when you sat down with him on the couch and said, I'm thinking about doing this? Was it, you're crazy, or okay, you can do it? Or I just wonder, I'm trying to imagine how I would have that conversation with my wife. How did that go between you and your husband?
Yeah, it's a great question, because certainly when we decided to get married, this is not what he signed up for. You know, we had a very busy life with juggling both of our careers as physicians at MUSC, and this was a huge pivot for me. We had a series of conversations. I first planted the seed. I said, I'm kind of thinking about this. Some folks have suggested this, but I'm not going to do it. And then I kind of kept planting the seed. And then when I knew I needed to make a decision, we actually made a reservation. We got a babysitter. We went out to brunch and we sat down and I said, listen, I need to know if you will support me if I do this. And I'm not going to do it without your support. This is a huge ask for you and for our kids. And he knew me well enough at that point, we'd been married for 10 years, to know that once I set my mind to something, I was going to do it full speed ahead. And so he got quickly on board, and he has been incredibly supportive.
Everyone's talking about real estate. The conversation continues with Voice for Real Estate podcast. Listen and learn from the experts who call the Carolinas home. Podcast advertising gives your business a voice of authority. Be heard. Advertise on this podcast. Visit voiceforrealestate.com.
You're listening to the Mount Pleasant podcast.
Well, the countdown to Election Day is on, and we'll be voting for someone to represent us at the U.S. House of Representatives in District 1. Dr. Annie Andrews is the Democratic Congress, hopefully, for her standpoint, hopefully be the Democratic congressman from our area. She will be reposed by the incumbent Republican Nancy Mace. So Dr. Andrews, as you look at, you're from Mount Pleasant, you're right here. If you were on Shem Creek, or if you were going to the Wando Crossing Center, maybe shopping at Marshall's there, and you bumped into somebody, what are the issues for people in Mount Pleasant that you think that you can really address?
Yeah, so when I've talked to a lot of folks in Mount Pleasant, because that is where I live. And so we have done a lot of campaigning in Mount Pleasant specifically. And I spent a lot of time talking to other moms like me who have kids in our local school system. And we talk about, two main issues, but really three issues. One is restoring women's reproductive freedom. I'm a physician and I am proudly pro-choice. And I do believe that that is one of the most urgent issues of this election. And I will fight to restore women's reproductive freedom. And a lot of my friends, are either going through IVF or have been through IVF, or who have experienced miscarriages, or have been pregnant with babies that were deeply wanted, but then ultimately had devastating diagnoses that told these moms that they wouldn't survive outside of the womb. So, my friends and I and my neighbors and everyone I'm talking to at events understand how nuanced this issue is. And I believe also see it like I see it, that really the government doesn't have a place making these decisions. It really should be between women and their physicians. So that is a big issue that I'm hearing about on the trail. Another issue, and an issue that I've been passionate about for a long time, is gun violence prevention. As a pediatrician, I know that this is now the number one cause of death for kids in this country and the number one cause of death for kids in South Carolina. And, that affects all of us. And even if we live in what we think is a very safe community, many people in our community are affected by gun violence, whether it's community gun violence, suicide from a family member, or our kids all go to school. And, my youngest is in kindergarten, and this year it's her first year in the public school system, and she's learning how to read, and she's so excited to be learning how to read. She's learning how to write, but she's also learning how to hide from a bad man with a gun in a closet in her classroom, because we have such an epidemic of gun violence in this country. And there are so many laws on which we agree. And so when I'm out there talking to parents, they are worried about the effect that these lockdown drills are going to have on our kids. And they're also just worried that one day it's going to be our child's school that is affected by, gun violence. And so that is another issue. And then you mentioned Shem Creek in the question. God, we are so blessed to live in such a beautiful part of the country. And we have to get serious about acting with urgency on climate change. The clock really is ticking. And and our kids are counting on us to act to preserve this beautiful environment that we are so blessed to live in. And so I think getting really serious about climate change legislation is another priority. And I think that that is an issue that also has really broad bipartisan support in our district because we see the beauty of our environment every day.
So a lot of people would say, what about the economy? I'm paying so much more for gas, inflation, all that. Where does that sit in terms of your priorities? And is there something that you think, okay, this is where we need to go? This is what we need to do to help families that way?
Yes, so great point. There's no denying that inflation is affecting all of us. I do a fair bit of grocery shopping for my big family with 3 kids, and I see the prices go up, and I see the total at the cash register go up. And I recognize that that is an incredibly important thing that we need to address. As a physician, I know how to multitask. As a working mom, I know how to do many things at once. And so I certainly will be focused on addressing inflation. And I think one of the things we have to recognize, of course, if we're talking about inflation, is this isn't just a uniquely American problem. This is a global problem right now, and it's a direct result of emerging from this global pandemic. And, we had demand go down, so supply went down, demand went back up, and supply hasn't caught quite up yet. So we have to get serious about it. And some of the things that we can do that, have been passed into law or that there have been some good votes in DC on are, things that affect families' bottom lines. So certainly it's groceries. It's also gas. And we can hold oil and gas companies accountable for price gouging at the pump. There was a vote on that. My opponent voted no to holding those companies accountable for price gouging. We also need to get serious about controlling the price of prescription drugs. I talk to parents of sick children all the time who are worried about whether they can afford their child's asthma inhaler or their child's insulin. And there's been some really great progress on this issue. There was the vote to cap the cost of insulin, and I would have voted yes on that. My opponent voted no. And then in the Inflation Reduction Act specifically, there's some really important measures to reduce the cost out-of-pocket costs for prescriptions for patients on Medicare. And that is really landmark progress that we've made to cap those costs for Medicare beneficiaries. And I would have voted yes on that. My opponent voted no. So I think we can talk about inflation, understand that it is a global problem that we need to get under control, but also think about other ways we can help folks with their bottom lines.
We're talking with Dr. Annie Andrews, the Democratic candidate for District 1 to represent us in Washington as part of the House of Representatives. I'm Brian Cleary. This is where the pages of Mount Pleasant Magazine come alive. It's the Mount Pleasant Podcast. And Dr. Andrews, as we get closer to the election, different candidates will say different things. It doesn't matter whether it's the Low Country, South Carolina, California, wherever. So in South Carolina, a Republican state, as it were, some people would say it might be easier for you to not say have a straightforward line on abortion as you do. Do you take that with a grain of salt? Was there ever a point to go, well, maybe if I sugarcoat this a little bit, it may help me get elected? Or are you just coming at it from the standpoint of this is what I believe, here we are?
Yeah. So first I'll say, my policy positions are really based on my perspective as a physician and my perspective as a mom. And, I'm not going to change my beliefs on an issue based on what polling tells me. But actually, my position on abortion is very mainstream. It's what we had under Roe. It's that women should have access to abortion services up until a point of fetal viability, which is typically determined to be about 24 weeks. And then after that, it's a decision, it's a discussion when there are those devastating cases of fetal anomalies or the mother's life is at risk. And in those cases, those decisions should be made between the mother and the physician. And those are the protections, that we had under Roe. And in fact, in South Carolina right now, with the heartbeat bill being in court, there are no abortions after 20 weeks, except for those circumstances that I'm talking about, the mother's life, fetal anomalies. And that is what I support. That is what I support. And that is the mainstream. That is the current law of the land in South Carolina. But some of these proposals that have been put up, like a national abortion ban at a certain number of very arbitrary number of weeks, Lindsey Graham's bill that's 15 weeks, that does not fall in line with the healthcare system. Women get their anatomy scans at 18 to 20 weeks. So if you ban any abortion after 15 weeks, that's going to eliminate a lot of options for a lot of women who receive devastating news at their anatomy ultrasound. And then what's worse, the most extreme version of an abortion ban is a personhood bill, where they define life as the moment of fertilization. Personhood bills outlaw abortion, they outlaw IVF. And actually, my opponent joined Marjorie Taylor Greene's personhood bill as a co-sponsor 5 days before the Dobbs decision leaked. And so that is, in my view, and in most people's view, the most extreme view you can have on abortion. And her name is on that bill right now, that pending legislation. And what I want is what we had under Roe, which again is supported by the vast majority of South Carolinians and the majority of Americans, and really is the mainstream opinion on this issue.
I mentioned the fact earlier that politics is a dirty game. And we've seen over the past, and you can kind of pick the period of time, however far back you want to go, where there's just polarization in our nation. So you're a Democrat, you've got an opponent, obviously, that's a Republican. You go to DC, there's Republicans, Democrats. Can you give us, for people in the middle, can you give us a little hope that it's not just all about that? Can we come together? Are you confident that I vote for you, you get elected, that when you get to DC, it's not just all Republican or all Democrat? There's a lot of people who are going, hey, can you talk to us in the middle?
Yes, absolutely. And I am with you on that. And that is one of the reasons I wanted to run, because I do not want to be a career politician. I want to go to Washington, D.C. and solve some problems, serve 3 terms, and then come back to my job as a pediatrician. And so that answers your question, because if I'm not seeking a career in politics, then there's no disincentive for me to work across the aisle. I want to solve problems. I'm taking a huge step back from the career I worked my whole life for to do this. And I'm not going to do it just to go up there and point fingers and score political points. I really, truly, honestly want to go up there and solve problems. And I will work with anyone who wants to work with me to solve these problems. I am not beholden to the Democratic Party leadership. They did not recruit me to run. I decided to run, and I'm running as a Democrat because my policy positions and my values align with that party. I'm not beholden to them. I'm not beholden to Republican leadership. I really want to solve problems. And I think if we replaced a few of our career politicians with people like me who bring some level of expertise and who are not seeking to make a political name for themselves, but just simply seeking to solve problems, I really think we could get past so much of this hyper-partisanship we see. When I am in the hospital and I have a sick kid in front of me and I know I need a subspecialist consult, say I need a pediatric cardiologist, I call the pediatric cardiologist and ask him if he'll help me with this patient. We agree to work together to come up with a plan. I don't ask him if he's a Republican or a Democrat. I'm going to work with him to help this kid. And we need more of that in Washington, D.C. And I hope that by my election and other folks like me who are stepping forward to get things under control up in DC, I really hope we can get past this crazy hyper-partisan stage we are in as a country.
Citizen government would be great. Now, when you say the 3 terms, so you'd serve 6 years, would you then be someone who would also say, hey, I'm a supporter of term limits, whether it's, Senator Graham or Representative Clyburn, a couple of folks who have been in there a long time, or, Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell, we've got career politicians. Is that something that you think, hey, let's get into term limits? Or is that just something that you would do yourself, but not necessarily push that as legislation?
I certainly believe we are ready for a new generation of leadership. And I think one way to encourage innovation in any industry, in the healthcare industry, in government, is term limits. You kind of run out of good ideas after a while and you need fresh perspectives. And for me, as a mom of 3 small kids, I was shocked when I learned that I think about 7% of current members of Congress have a child under the age of 18. We need people serving in government, making these decisions that our children are counting on. We need people who are in the thick of parenting, like I am, people who understand the urgency of acting on gun violence, on, restoring women's reproductive freedom so our daughters have the same rights our mothers had. But when you have a bunch of, older, predominantly male, predominantly white men making these decisions, it's not the same perspective that young parents of young children can bring. So I am very passionate about a new generation of leadership, and particularly passionate about people who are in the thick of parenthood, helping to make these decisions that are going to so drastically affect our children and our future grandchildren.
Dr. Annie Andrews is our guest today on the Mount Pleasant podcast. This is, of course, from the magazine, Mount Pleasant Magazine. Hopefully you pick up a copy of that when you're coming in and out, say, of Harris Teeter, and read all about what's happening in Mount Pleasant. She's a resident of Mount Pleasant. She'll be running against Republican Nancy Mace coming up in November in the election to decide who will be serving the first district, the first congressional district here in the Palmetto State. Now, Dr. Andrews, you've got this beautiful new facility, the MUSC Shawn Jenkins Children's Hospital. Let me just veer away from politics a little bit. Had to be amazing to be able to finally, COVID, of course, played with that, but to move into that beautiful new facility, which I have to think made this decision a little more challenging, to walk away from state-of-the-art new stuff. MUSC is really just a gem of the Lowcountry.
Yes, you are right. And I hope that a lot of listeners have had the opportunity to see Shawn Jenkins Children's Hospital, because it is a state-of-the-art facility. It is beautiful. And I worked for many years in the old Children's Hospital, and I was excited to move to the new hospital. Who doesn't want to work in a shiny new building? But what I underestimated was the impact it would have on our patients and their families, particularly patients who have complex chronic diseases. These kids are in and out of the hospital their whole childhood. We get to know these parents, and they often have very long lengths of stay. And now they get to stay in this beautiful facility with these huge windows. The kids can overlook the water, count the sailboats. I mean, it really just was a huge, huge benefit to Lowcountry kids and their families when that facility opened. And, I believe that the care we've provided at the Children's Hospital at MUSC, before the new building, was very high quality and continues to be high quality. But it's nice to have a facility that matches the quality of care you're providing. And I think it was also a good morale boost for all of the care team members, the nurses, respiratory therapists, the pharmacists, the custodial workers, the folks who cook the kids their food. It is a wonderful place to work. And, like I said before, I don't plan on stepping away forever. I look forward to getting back into that building and caring for the Lowcountry's children. But we are so blessed to have this gem in our city. And, I've been so honored to be able to work there over the past 13 years.
A world-class facility, no doubt about it. It's just so wonderful to have that right here in the Lowcountry. So we've talked about some of the hot button issues in terms of the election coming up. One that you haven't weighed in on, let me hit you with this one. It may be as important to members of Palmetto State than anything. Coming up in November, South Carolina plays Clemson. Have you got a dog in that fight? Where do you go with Tigers or Gamecocks?
So I hope this doesn't hurt me politically, but I don't have a dog in that fight. But, because I didn't grow up here, but my kids, it is so fun to see them pick sides. They come home from school hearing from their friends who are either, for Clemson or USC. And it's just fun to hear them talk about it very excitedly. That's how I was when I grew up in Indianapolis. It was always IU versus Purdue. So my daughter my fifth grade daughter is a big Clemson fan. So I guess I'll go with Clemson on this one. But I just love that. I love fall football season. Growing up, I was an Indianapolis Colts fan, and I just love how that brings people together, gives people an excuse to hang out together. It's fun to teach my kids the rules of football. I grew up with two brothers, so I knew very early on how football worked, and it's fun to teach that to my kids. And, we like to watch the games outside on our back porch. Sometimes we'll have a fire, and I just love this season. So yeah, it's fun to watch my kids learn to love the sport as well.
And let me salute your courage as a politician, because I've talked to some politicians who won't give an answer on Carolina Clemson. So honesty means a lot in this case. And we've got your daughter and the two other kids that'll come along one way or the other. So that's great. So coming up in November, people are going to be going to the polls. I think we can all agree. And if we can go to someplace, again, we can agree the importance of getting out and actually taking the time to vote. Or we've got early voting coming up as well.
That's right. Your early voting starts on October 24th. And, the state legislators passed a great bill that allows no excuse early voting for 2 weeks leading up to Election Day. And I just really encourage people to get out and vote early because you never know what's going to happen on November 8th. You might have a flat tire. You might wake up not feeling well. Things might get crazy at work. The lines might be long. So if you have time, just show up and vote early. You don't have to have a reason. You just show up and vote. And you're right, we all have the privilege of participating in our democracy, and our vote is our voice and our vote is our power. There is a lot on the line in November, so I encourage people to educate themselves about their choices, ask questions. We know all of the candidates have public forums. Come out, meet the candidates, ask questions, make an informed decision, but certainly use your voice, use your vote.
And Dr. Andrews, let me give you the opportunity right here. November 8th, the election's coming up. You're on the ballot against the Republican, Nancy Mace. She's the incumbent. Why is it that I should vote for Dr. Annie Andrews?
So I am not a career politician. I want to go to Washington to solve problems. And I've had the privilege of serving this community as a pediatrician. And so this community has trusted me for over 13 years with their kids. And now I'm asking them to trust me with their vote.
And for people who want to get more information about your campaign, if they want to get information about you, donate, volunteer, whatever it is, how can they get that information?
Yeah, so they can go to drannieandrews.com. That's just drannieandrews.com. There you can contribute to the campaign. You can read about where I stand on issues we didn't have a chance to cover today. You can sign up to volunteer. And then folks can also follow me on social media. I'm just at Annie Andrews MD on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
And as you've gotten into it, obviously it's your first time, unless you were part of student council way back when or whatever, the campaign trail, a grind. Do you take to it? How have you been doing on that?
It's exhausting. It's exhilarating. These last few weeks are really just crazy. You know, I'm missing a lot of dinners at home with my kids and a lot of bedtimes, a lot of after school activities. But it is a privilege, honestly, to be able to go out in the community every day and meet voters and hear from voters about what matters to them. And, you know, for so long, I've worked in the hospital setting that I really had a social bubble. You know, pretty much everybody I knew socially was a doctor or a nurse or some other way connected to MUSC. And I've just met so many incredible community members through this campaign. And that is something that I can take with me, win or lose. But it's exhausting, but also exhilarating, incredibly motivating, because I am happy to be able to be the voice for so many people who feel very passionately about the issues I feel passionate about.
And there'll be so much time to sleep after November 8th.
Right.
It's not that you're not used to, as a doctor, working some long hours in the hospital, I'm sure.
That's right. We the day we filmed all of our commercials was a really, really long day. And at the end of it, I texted the producer and I said, you know, I've worked many 30-hour shifts in the hospital, but today was the hardest work day I've ever had.
Well, thank you for all that hard effort. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, November 8th, it'll be up to you. As Dr. Andrews said, it's important regardless. Get out and vote for the candidate of your choice. It's a privilege that we all have living in this great nation of ours, and one that we should take seriously and do so responsibly. Dr. Annie Andrews, thank you so much for joining us on Mount Pleasant Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
November 8th, get out and do it. It's your constitutional right, your constitutional privilege. It's a privilege of living in this nation. Make certain to get out and vote for the candidate of your choice. And thank you for joining us today on Mount Pleasant Podcast.
Thanks for spending your time with the Mount Pleasant Podcast, your community, your podcast. Listen to past and future episodes at mountpleasantpodcast.com.